We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Donc, rebonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à la 4e table ronde sur les défis multilatéraux, en fait, de coopération au niveau du renseignement. J'ai 4 collègues avec nous, 2 en ligne qui présenteront. Permettez-moi d'abord de vous les présenter rapidement. Si j'ai bien compris, nos 2 premiers vont faire 2 présentations jumelées. C'est bien ça, Sarah-Myriam? OK. Donc, Thomas, OK, je vois ici Thomas qui hoche la tête. Donc, le premier, effectivement, sera Thomas Juneau, qui est professeur à l'École supérieure d'affaires publiques et internationales à l'Université d'Ottawa. Avant de se joindre à l'Université d'Ottawa, il a travaillé au ministère de la Défense du Canada de 2003 à 2014, principalement comme analyste stratégique sur le Moyen-Orient. Donc, ses intérêts de recherche et son expertise porte principalement sur le Moyen-Orient, en particulier l'Iran et le Yémen, sur la politique étrangère et de défense du Canada, sur la relation entre le renseignement et les politiques et sur les théories des relations internationales. Ensuite, nous avons Stéphanie Carvin, qui est professeure de relations internationales à Norman Paterson School of International Affairs à Ottawa. Ses recherches portent sur le droit international, la sécurité, le terrorisme et la technologie. Et elle enseigne dans les domaines de la protection des infrastructures critiques, de la technologie, de la guerre, de la politique étrangère. Ensuite, nous avons ici à ma droite et au bout de la table, Justin Massie, qui est avec son masque, qui est professeur, pardon, je vais commencer par ça, qui est professeur de sciences politiques à l'Université du Québec à Montréal et co-directeur du réseau d'analyse stratégique. Il fut titulaire de la chaire de recherche Fulbright sur les relations canado-américaines à la Paul Neitz, si je le prononce bien, School of Advanced International Studies à Johns Hopkins University en 2019. Ses recherches, son expertise porte sur les interventions militaires multinationales, la transition mondiale de la puissance, la paradiplomatie et la politique étrangère de défense du Canada. Et finalement, ma collègue et amie, la professeure Chantal Lavallée, donc professeure de relations d'études internationales et directrice adjointe du critique au Collège militaire royal de Saint-Jean. Elle détient aussi un doctorat de l'UQAM, donc on est plusieurs ici avec des racines à l'UQAM, on ne se le cachera pas. Elle est experte de l'Union européenne. Elle travaille notamment sur la question des technologies émergentes et des drones et de la coopération justement sur ces enjeux. Donc, je laisse la parole pour commencer à Thomas. Environ 12 minutes chacun, s'il vous plaît, tout le monde.
Bonjour. Alors, merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation au colloque. Ça me fait plaisir d'être là virtuellement. Là, malheureusement, c'était un peu trop compliqué, là, surtout pour des questions de logistique familiale, de me présenter sur place. Alors, what I'm going to do today is give a presentation. The presentation that I'm going to give is based on research that Stephanie Carvin and I have done together. I will give this first part, and then in the next presentation, I think Stephanie will give a second presentation also based on work that we've done together. But we figured it would just be easier if we each did a presentation instead of splitting both of them. Next slide, please. So what I will present is what Stephanie and I have done as our major research project over the last basically 5 years. The starting research question was, how does intelligence analysis support policymaking in Canada, and how can it be improved? And are there any lessons from the Canadian case that can be useful for other national contexts? And the basic idea is that virtually no research has been done to answer this question in the Canadian context. A fair bit has been done in the US, a little has been done in the UK or in Israel, but really nothing in this country, or really not much. So we did 70 interviews, mostly in 2018-19, with both policy officials, so consumers of intelligence, and intelligence officials, and also a handful with political staff in ministers' offices and prime ministers' offices. We spoke to individuals who were serving. We also spoke to individuals who were retired, most cases very recently retired. We spoke to people at every level of the community. We spoke to analysts, to mid-level managers, and to deputy ministers or heads of agencies, CSIS, CSC, and so on. All interviews obviously were anonymous to make sure that people would feel free to speak. About 10 of these interviews were done in the US, where we talked to American officials, again, serving and retired in different parts of the American national security community, to get their views on the Canadian community. And it was actually really interesting to get that outside perspective on how the Canadian intelligence community is perceived in Washington. Next slide, please. The result of this research is a book that Stephanie and I released in the fall of last year. So basically what I'll be doing now is to present the key findings of this book. So it's basically going to be 280 pages in the 9.5 minutes that I have left. So it's going to be very high level, but that's, if you're interested, feel free to buy the book, available on Amazon or directly on the website of Stanford University Press, where it was published. Next slide, please. So main findings at a very high level. Overall, the performance of the intelligence analysis community in Canada in providing a service to senior policymakers is not as good as it should be. It is not optimal, but it has improved a lot in recent years. The point where we're at today, or where we were at in 2019-20 when we finished research and writing the book, is far better than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And our interviews clearly showed that trend of progress. That being said, this assessment is highly uneven. There are some pockets in the intelligence community that are actually really good, and some pockets that are quite mediocre, and you have everything in between. What explains this trend of progress? It's electroshocks to the system, which are at least in part responsible for this improvement. I will not say more about that because that is by and large the topic of book 2, and Stephanie will be talking about that right after this. One issue that this raises is the question of the sustainability of this progress. It's not because there's been a positive trend in recent years that there's any kind of guarantee that things will continue getting better. That's not automatic by any means. Third main finding is the question of why. Why is it that we're doing okay but not great? There's a lot of reasons for that. We go into more detail into that in the book, but one of these reasons is that we're a country that historically has been quite safe. And because we've been quite safe, it has meant that there has been a limited need for intelligence. Basically, our senior policy leaders, our senior politicians have limited appetite for intelligence simply because they don't need it that much. There's been little cost for them to ignore it or to neglect it or to make decisions that have been contrary to intelligence findings. That, in a way, is a good thing. It's better to be safe than not safe. But the question that it raises for future projects is, as the international security environment, including Canada's, deteriorates, there will arguably be in the future a need for more intelligence. So how will we adjust? Next slide, please. So I will spend about 2 minutes on the next 4 slides, which are the core 4 empirical chapters in the book. The first one is on governance and structure. And here we look into quite a bit of detail into the governance of the relationship between intelligence analysis and how it feeds into policy making in the Canadian government. A few key points. First of all, our institutions that are responsible for this interface between intelligence and policy are not sophisticated. They're immature, they're weak. That goes at multiple levels, but it includes at the center, where there is no strong fusion or coordinating unit that could really play a leadership role for the community as a whole. Things have improved in the last few years. We have an entire section in the book that details the deputy minister level committees that are responsible for, and you have the 3 acronyms here, policy, analysis, and operations, to manage that interface. But so it's much better today than it was 10 years ago, but there's still a lot of progress. In a context where institutions are fairly weak, not surprisingly, that opens up scope for personalities to take on much more importance. If we were in a context like the US where institutions were stronger, of course, personalities still matter, but less so because institutions play a more perennial, permanent role. Not the case here. That starts at the very top and obviously trickles down the food chain. But clearly what it means is that when you have a prime minister like Jacques Chrétien, who, and this is not a judgment on his overall prime ministership, is not very much interested in intelligence analysis, that has a trickle-down effect that makes other senior officials in the government not very interested. When a new prime minister comes in 2006, and we interviewed a lot of people who were involved in that transition and in the early years, Harper, who is very interested in intelligence analysis, that has the exact reverse trickle-down effect where ministers, deputy ministers, and everybody else in the food chain becomes more interested in intelligence analysis because the big boss is. Trudeau comes in, he is somewhere in the middle. Third point, I won't go into detail on this, but it's the issue of review and oversight. There's been a revolution in Canadian intelligence in the last 5 years or so with the creation of new review and oversight bodies. We were extremely weak as a democracy at this level until not so long ago. This over time will have a major impact on every aspect of the work of the intelligence community, including analysis, but obviously everything else. We don't really look at that in the book simply because at the time of writing, it was still too early. But for future projects, it's definitely something to look at. Next slide, please. We have an entire chapter on the management of analytical units, stuff that can get some people to roll their eyes, but is extremely important because if you get everything else right, but not the management right, if you get the management wrong, the human resources wrong, you're not going to be able to get the job done. Recruitment challenges throughout the intelligence community are still very important. Career paths are a serious source of frustration because once you're an analyst, it's difficult to progress through the ranks because you're either an analyst or you get out of the analyst stream to do something else. That's a source of tension. Analysts, and I'll get to that in the next slide, in the intelligence community, tend to have a very weak understanding of the policy context in which they work, of the policy leaders they should be supporting. One way, ideally, to remedy that weakness would be to have more exchanges and secondments, right? Where intelligence analysts can go spend 2 years in a policy position anywhere else in the government so that they can develop their policy reflexes and literacy, but that's hard. It happens a bit, but really not as much as it should. One point that is a bit surprising and certainly disappointing, training and professional development, generally speaking, is not very good, to be blunt. Some of it is good, some of it is quite mediocre, and that's a problem. Mid-level management, so the direct supervisors of intelligence analysts, by speaking to those mid-level managers, those under them, those above them, we found that in our interviews, we found that there are serious weaknesses at that level, though again, quite a bit of improvement in recent years. Next slide, please. So if we go a bit more in detail at really the nexus between intelligence and policy. One of the key findings of the book is that policy literacy, as I just mentioned, in the intelligence community is low. By policy literacy, what we mean here is when you take intelligence analysts individually and collectively, what is their understanding of the policy world that they're meant to support, the policy priorities? How does the policy process work? Who are the people doing these policy jobs? The general understanding in the intelligence community of that is low, but it is increasing. It is a lot more today than it was just 10 years ago. But the reverse is also true. If you look at the policy community, people who are tasked with developing and implementing policy, quite often their own understanding of what intelligence is, what it can do, is quite low. Client relations, a topic that I find especially interesting, i.e. the marketing dimension of intelligence analysis, how to get your products out there, how to convince people that they are interesting and worth their time, is a serious challenge. Is for a lot of people, especially in academia, a bit of a buzzword that again gets them rolling their eyes and is perceived to be meaningless, but it actually is not. In our system of government, decisions are made collectively by cabinet, but a lot of the intelligence analysis that goes all the way up does not reflect that whole of government reality of decision making. It is siloed, it is fragmented, and that's a problem. There's a need for more fusion. Politicization is a topic that Stephanie and I really like to research and argue about. Bottom line, and we can get more into the detail here, there is no problem with the hard politicization of intelligence analysis in this country. And we've done, there was a complete consensus in our interviews at that level. Next slide, please. What makes a product useful? I will be quick on this because Marie-Hélène Chaillet in her presentation this morning talked a fair bit about that. But what she was talking about this morning is what ideally makes a product useful. But then the question that we tried to look at, and this is, I think, chapter 6 in the book, does it actually happen? Right? There's the ideal, as she was saying, of timely, relevant products, etc. But is that what is actually produced and delivered to clients? And the answer to that is very mixed. Ideally, a product should target government priorities. It shouldn't be analysts writing, as she was saying this morning, about whatever country they feel like writing that morning. That would be useless. It doesn't happen enough. Short products are better. When I started in government in the early 2000s, you would regularly see intelligence products that were 5, 10, I remember 50 or 60 page products. And to be blunt, that is completely useless because nobody above any executive level will read anything that is more than 2 or 3 pages, except in exceptional circumstances. It is a lot better at that level now. 50 page or even 10 page products happen still, but far less. Products have to be visually appealing. And this is something that the community has massively improved on, especially in more recent years. When I started in government, products were basically full page, 11-point type size, and just not appealing to read. It's not because deputy ministers are illiterate or like cartoons, but it's really because as incredibly busy people, you need to make it appealing and you need to convince them. There's a marketing dimension. A lot of improvement here. Same thing for oral briefings, a lot of improvement. There were none just a few years ago, a lot now. Methods is a really interesting point. If we had this discussion in the US, about half of the presentation would be on methodology training. In this country, far less. And when we asked senior clients, they really don't want to be bothered by that. Overclassification is still a big problem, i.e. products are unnecessarily classified at the highest levels, and that just makes their usability and dissemination much harder than it needs to be. Open sources, Carleton and Michaud talked a lot about that before lunch, so I won't get into it. So let's move on to the next slide as my time is running short. So this is my conclusion slide, just a few points to throw out there. Transparency, Carleton and Michaud talked about that a fair bit. There is a need for the intelligence community as a whole to really be more transparent. There's been massive improvement in the last 10 years, but there's a long way to go. And you can draw parallels to the discussion that I heard in the previous panel on diversity. Transparency, like diversity, is the right thing to do very much on moral grounds. But there's also a very pragmatic argument to be more transparent because a lack of transparency is counterproductive. Next point. When you talk to intelligence people, they frame themselves and their community and their work as exceptional, as unique. In many ways it is, but in many ways it is not. They are an expert community like any other in government. And one point that we make in the conclusion of the book is that as long as there's this self-perception that they are much more exceptional than they actually are, it really impacts negatively their ability to be useful because it makes them stand apart too much. Canada-US relations, to be blunt, what if Trump wins in 2024? A lot of difficult questions come up at multiple levels, but one of them is in terms of the impact on our intelligence partnership with the US. Non-traditional partners, I won't say anything on this because Stephanie will move to that right in the next presentation. So why don't I stop right here to transition to her. Thank you.
Merci Thomas. Stéphanie, à toi.
Merci. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un plaisir d'avoir l'occasion de vous présenter aujourd'hui. Mon présentation, c'est sur le sujet de coopération entre les partenaires traditionnels. J'espère, non-traditional partners, j'utilise Google Translate. Alors, je suis désolée. Les institutions traditionnelles dans la communauté de la sécurité du raisonnement et les ministères non traditionnels comme Innovation, Science, Développement économique. Et nous appelons ces interactions electroshocks, right? And we use this to explain change in the community itself. So just change the slide? Let's just go with the slide.
Just say change slides or
change
next slide.
Changer, yeah. S'il vous plaît. Changer.
Next slide.
Oh. There we go. So why do national security intelligence agencies change and adapt over time? And I won't go into too much detail. We have a paper, but we have specific definitions for change, reform, and adaptation, because that's kind of the three ways. But basically the idea, the way that the way intelligence is actually requested and presented, the way that institutions themselves are actually adapted and changed through legislation, or they adapt themselves or reform themselves. And then adaptation is how do you actually respond to a new threat. Slide, please, change. So the reason we came up with this is that, you know, in doing the first book, we looked at the literature on change and reform, and a lot of it comes from the US, it comes from France, Israel, the United Kingdom, and this literature suggests that there's really only two answers to how the national security agencies change, and one is through strategic surprise or intelligence failure. And this really doesn't work for Canada because we don't actually like to be as blunt as possible. Our community doesn't do anything. We're like, not saying we don't do anything, but like it's relative to our partners, it's very small. We don't have a foreign human intelligence service, so like the actual scope for us to fail is much smaller, right? So that's one of the reasons why we think that there's not a good explanation, and we had tried to come up with our own. Slide, please. Now, there's other reasons here too. Of course, you know, some of the points that Thomas raised, which I will not go over. But basically, we did really see the first attempt at trying to spark change within the community with Afghanistan. And this might be the closest we've come to an intelligence failure. There was a jails breaks in Afghanistan, as well as when people started dying in the mission and people wanting to figure out why that was. And it really did bring policy people and the intelligence and defense people together around a table, really for the first time in Canadian history to sit, well, at least post-World War II, to try and figure out what was actually going on. And this led to the creation of this, became known as the Afghan Task Force, which really did improve intelligence policy cooperation and advice. And you know, it was good, but like when Canada pulls out of Afghanistan, they decide not to continue it, which is, you know, really unfortunate, because I think it would have been so great for PCO to have such a body going forward. But the decision was, okay, we're leaving Afghanistan, we don't need this body to continue. So this really did leave us in a position where by the early 2010s, we had seen improvement, as Thomas discussed in his paper, of the Canadian national security intelligence community, but there was still a lot of room for improvement in terms of how both intelligence and policy coordinated. Next slide, please. So we came up with this idea, as I said, of electroshocks, and really an electroshock as an explanation for change in the community is that it comprises three things. The first is that there's an unforeseen event. It creates a sudden shift in threat perception. And that thirdly, that the intelligence community is poorly set up to address the threat by itself. And it requires partners that has not traditionally worked with before, the non-traditional partners. Slide. So we differentiate this from traditional explanations. So the strategic surprise or the intelligence failure. We say that the differences with an electroshock is that there's no immediate negative consequence for the country in which it takes place. The realization of a potential or future negative consequence motivates change, reform, and adaptation. So it's more about the potential for something to happen, and then the remoteness, but how soon that potential future negative consequence will come influences on how the electroshock will play out. And this actually becomes really important for the pandemic. Slide, please. So we don't have time, obviously, to go into our case studies that we will be looking at on this project. We're looking at basically the Investment Canada Act, extremist travelers or foreign fighters, threats to democratic institutions, really with the election of Donald Trump, and then the COVID-19 pandemic. Slide, please. In an electroshock, then, with these 4 case studies, we basically determined that there's 3 phases to each. The first is that there's the recognition of the problem and the need for cooperation. Secondly, that there is learning. So basically, learning is kind of it's often the non-traditional partner having to develop the capacity to actually absorb intelligence, because they may not even have SCIFs or secure I can never say what a SCIF is. Secure compartmentalized information facilities, right? Or like, you know, basically the systems that can even hold intelligence. For the intelligence community, it's going to be learning about how their non-traditional partner operates, what their priorities are, cooperation. And then in the final stage, you do have some kind of exchange. Slide, please. So what the conditions that allow for electroshocks are really a few things, and it kind of reflects what we talked about before. Canada has a less mature and weaker intelligence community especially relative to its main allies, the US and the UK. The pathways for intelligence sharing in allied countries is largely established. And we found that, like, even when Donald Trump was in power in the US, the channels which feed intelligence were still largely working. There was still a large appetite for that information. Whereas, as Thomas just said, in Canada, it tends to be very personally driven, and the impact of the Prime Minister in particular can have a big role. Secondly, it's personally driven, that, personalities can shape outcomes. If people really get along well and understand each other well, that relationship usually works well. And if they don't, it can actually go pretty badly. I've heard numerous stories where, someone doesn't understand what intelligence is, or doesn't really care about policy, and the relationship that's been built up over a few months or even a few years can actually wither away pretty quickly. And that our community is very decentralized, which again was a big finding of our book. The way intelligence is coordinated and organized is fairly decentralized. But that means then that it's actually relatively easy to kind of form new relationships without having to go through a whole bunch of processes. Next slide, please. So this is kind of our chart of successful electroshocks. You will see here, we obviously we don't have time to go through all of these, but we define what the electroshock is. We talk about what the unforeseen event is, the perception shifts, and non-traditional partners. So if we focus mostly on COVID, obviously the unforeseen event is a global pandemic. It's the perception shift is the way national security elements interact with public health emergencies, right? I think we've been pretty clear from the start, at least I think Thomas and I agree on this, so we're writing together, that the pandemic itself is a public health emergency with national security elements in it, rather than a national security crisis in and of itself. And then finally, the non-traditional partner that the community had to work with was the Public Health Agency of Canada, which had worked with the intelligence community before, but mostly on kind of bioweapons, chemical weapons, those kinds of threats. This was a whole different kind of coordination. Slide, please. So I won't go over this one because so we have like a whole presentation here on the ICA and how the ICA worked. I don't think we have time to go through with it, but if anyone has questions, happy to talk about it in the question and answer. So just skip this slide, please. And I think the next one as well. Right. So let's talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, because it's the topic of this conference. Again, it's not a national security issue, but an issue with national security implications. And there was a numerous one. So there's the realization pretty quickly that there's a lot of intellectual property theft and economic espionage going home. This became even a worse issue because of economic, the fact that people are working from home. They no longer have secure environments, and it's pretty easy to steal information if people don't have secure routers. There was the spread of disinformation online, particularly with regards to vaccines. But also there's a lot of cybercrime that came out of this as well, right? People were told, oh, click here for the latest on vaccines and things like that. And people would click on that and they, could get their credentials stolen and things like this. Online radicalization has been a considerable threat as well. The safety of the vaccine supply, as well as critical digital infrastructure, which we've just discussed. Slide, please. So again, the non-traditional partner was Public Health Agency of Canada. There was, if you look at some description of the intelligence community before the COVID-19 pandemic, the PHAC is actually included, but not in the way that it became known, right? So there's an intelligence team within PHAC that kind of became in charge of liaising with the community. But there was a number of things that were, with CSE, CSIS, I said they were worried about research security. With Public Health Agency of Canada, they did a lot of work with CBSA because all of a sudden, people who are experts in spotting fraudulent Jimmy Choo shoes and designer handbags or fake designer handbags or finding drugs suddenly are having to determine whether or not COVID tests coming across the border are valid. Like, how do you know whether or not a COVID test is legitimate or not? And so there's a lot of work on those two things. And again, so it's not a perfect relationship, but the immediacy of the issue really did, when we talk about those three phases of the electroshock, it happened very, very quickly. And in this paper, one of the things I do try to show is that with the ICA, because there wasn't the immediacy or the clarity of threats, that the ICA process was actually a bit of a hot dumpster fire, and it didn't work particularly well. So slide, please. So again, and this is something we don't have a huge amount of time. I think I have like literally 2 minutes. So when do electroshocks fail? They don't always work. So we argue that when at least one of the key criteria, the unforeseen issue, a shift in threat perception, or if the IC is unable to handle it, so if the IC can handle it itself, then you don't really see an electroshock. And we did have 2 examples that I want to test out. So this is still a little bit experimental, but I think the first here is climate change. It's not unforeseen, and there is no sudden shift in threat perception. So, despite the fact that it is going to have this giant impact on Canadian national security, we haven't really seen the kinds of change adaptation or reforms, I think, yet that would kind of turn it into an electroshock. And same, interestingly enough, with I think the threat of far right or ideologically motivated violent extremism. Despite numerous attacks, there was no sudden threat perception that's possibly due to bias within the community itself, and despite numerous attacks. But we didn't really see, that started in 2017, but it's only really been in the last, I would say, year or two that we're starting to see huge shifts in the national security community. And so a better explanation for why we are seeing some shifts in these spaces is not coming from the community itself, but actually a response to government priorities and government concerns. But we want to test that out. It's a little bit hypothetical. Next slide. So that's kind of what we think it looks like in total. So you have the electroshock and electroshock failure, why it works, why it doesn't. And I think there's one more slide after this. Next slide. Yes. So again, electroshocks do not necessarily generate fast cooperation. It helps if the issue is more immediate, if the issue is specific, and the pandemic certainly was. But the issues are that the weak the weak learning culture within the community has impacted the ability to transport lessons from one case to another, one electroshock to another. And then one of the other things we'd like to see is that if this model pans out and we get it out there, could it actually help explain change in other communities as well? I think that's everything. Slide.
Merci,
yep, we're
Stéphanie.
done. Okay. Yeah. Merci.
Merci. We'll have to talk about climate change one day. Justin.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about Ukraine, so I don't have a book to present. I haven't finished it yet on the new invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Still working on it. And so I don't have to crowd a book in 12 minutes, fortunately. Just a few brief remarks that I have on the situation. The main point I want to emphasize is that I fear that we're drawing the wrong lessons from the war. I'm trying to understand how allies have responded and anticipated this invasion of Ukraine. And I feel that there's, first of all, an over-optimism because, of course, Russia is failing, or at least has failed its plan A and plan B to invade the country. First, the Blitzkrieg, of course, failed with the objective of creating a rapid regime change. And then even the plan B of encircling Kyiv failed as well. And so they've moved to plan C with focusing on Donbass. So there's, I think, also no more optimism because of the resistance, surprisingly, very strong resistance by the Ukrainian army that I fear again that we're drawing the wrong lessons of the war. I feel that there's a sentiment that there's a perception, I think, in the international community, and especially in the West, that the US side coming, that NATO has resurrected since its mort cérébrale, as President Macron mentioned it, that defense budgets are rising, and that China has not yet taken advantage of the war. And so everything is going well because Ukraine is winning and all of this is happening. I'm going to try to deconstruct these ideas. First, about the US anticipation of Russia's invasion. You have to remember that the Europeans were in disbelief. There was strong divergences within the alliance at the beginning of the war, before the war, with France, the Germans saying, we think it's a bluff. We don't think he's going to invade. This is merely for negotiation purposes, that he's amassing close to 200,000 troops around Ukraine. And Germany has recently, the chancellor has recently acknowledged that they got Putin wrong. They got Russia wrong. There was a failure, I think, from European intelligence agencies to anticipate Russia's intentions and its resolve to use force to achieve its political objectives. But to be fair, I think we have to recognize that most of us were surprised and that there was a very good strategy used by the U.S. intelligence to provide information about when the invasion would take place, how it would take place. I think the U.S. administration has been very good at doing this at the beginning of the war. However, we have to recognize as well that it failed to anticipate the current situation, stalemate or incapacity of Russia's military to achieve its plan A and plan B. It also underestimated the resolve and fighting abilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. And having known this, I think perhaps the United States, the British and Canadians that were training Ukrainians prior to the war would have provided more weapons, more training, had they known that the invasion was going to happen, that limited forces that were only about 200 soldiers would have been bigger, I think, had we known this. There was an overestimation, of course, of Russia's capacity to wage a major conventional war, because we based our analysis on past experience like Chechnya, like the Donbass in Syria, which have nothing to do with invading a 44 million people country, much bigger than of course, all of these other countries. The considerable weaknesses also that we've seen in Russia's military in terms of C2, logistics, morale, and intelligence were not foreseen properly, or at least not publicly, with the available information that I have. About NATO's resurrection or renaissance, it is, of course, displaying strong unity and solidarity. I think we can recognize this, the coordination about the weapon supply, about the troops, the increased troops on the eastern border, and also in new countries like Romania, like Slovakia and elsewhere. And also the sanctions, I think, unprecedented level of sanctions and very well coordinated. But I think we have to also emphasize other aspects of this. In terms of the deployment of troops, it's very asymmetric. There's still the similar problems of burden sharing. If you compare to the thousands of US soldiers that have been deployed to Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, compared to the 120 Canadians with an artillery battery, it's still the same burden sharing problems that we've witnessed before. If you look at the weapons that have been supplied, there's huge discrepancies in terms of the quantity and the quality of weapons that have been provided. So a lot of countries were not prepared to provide quickly weapons to the Ukrainian army because they thought they would probably lose very quickly. So why should we supply weapons? Why should we have them at the capacity to give them very rapidly? Canada did not have anything else to give other than what we gave to the Kurds, but the Iraqi government said no. And so it was in the Montreal depot for 6 years. So we gave them this, and then we're out of stock. Sorry, we may give you a check. And this is what was announced yesterday. In terms of sanctions, we have to recognize that the West is isolated. The majority of countries in the world are not sanctioning Russia. I mean, we emphasize a lot the votes that are costless at the UN General Assembly, but we don't emphasize enough that when it costs money to impose sanctions on your own economy, this is when you see which country, I think, are truly condemning Russia's invasion. And so I believe that we have to emphasize this as well. above the coordination and very strong solidarity that we tend to emphasize. And in terms of defense budget, it's the same thing. If you look at the greatest announcement by Germany of providing 100 billion new money in the next few years, is going to be spread over several years by 2026. And to achieve the 2% of GDP, they're still missing 52 billion for the German economy to provide. So it's less than NATO's objective that was, or the pledge that was made in 2014. The other element I want to emphasize is that we tend to only focus on the fact that the war is Russia's fault, which is true. It is the country that invited another one and violated the UN Charter. However, we should also emphasize that NATO failed to deter Russia from invading, because we need to draw lessons about this, about the future of that war, which will not end with a peace, with the cessez-le-feu shortly, with a ceasefire, because that war has begun in 2014, not in 2022. The security guarantee is that Ukraine is seeking from NATO allies to guarantee its neutrality in a future deal with Russia will expose those divisions, I think, within NATO. And the idea of letting Ukraine become a neutral country without a capacity to deter future aggressions by Russia, we have to draw lessons from that as well. We could do a counterfactual analysis saying, well, in 2008, maybe we should have accepted George Bush's view that we should have given the map, the membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. By then, perhaps it would have deterred Russia from invading. The common view at that time was, no, we should not give it to Ukraine because it's going to provoke Putin to invade Russia. So we're drawing, again, I think, the wrong lessons from this. So I'm going to emphasize now Canada's point of view. What should we go from there? What should Canada go from here, and what lessons can be learned? First of all, I think we need to better anticipate. And one of the good news I saw in the budget was not the money, it was this idea of that we're going to review the defense policy 5 years after its latest pronunciation or statement in 2017. But it needs to be done properly. We need to tap into academic and think tank expertise. We should include opposition parties so that it's not a partisan or very liberal defense review, but really a Canadian one. And we should mobilize Canadians that they truly engage with that policy. And we should do it every 5 years, not just when there's an invasion of our partner country. I felt, of course, as you probably did as well, that it was very underwhelming defense spending increase with 8 billion over the next few years, especially given the very strong rhetoric of Minister Freeland. I'm going to quote you two things. She says that the world's democracies, including our own, can be safe only once the Russian tyrant and his armies are entirely vanquished. So we want to defeat Russia. So we're going to invest $1.6 billion in Canadian defense and provide 500 million to the Ukrainians. That's going to work, yeah. And then we know that freedom does not come for free, and that peace is guaranteed only by our readiness to fight for it. But we're not ready to fight for Ukraine. There's a huge discrepancy between the rhetoric, which I think the government wants to be in phase with what's going on, but it's very risk aversion towards spending more towards defense. Third thing we should do is to prioritize, which means making tough political choices. There's a lot of investments to be made in Canadian defense, whether in North Warning System, in new fighters, frigates, drones, personnel. But we have other debates as well that are coming. Should we acquire new submarines? Will they be nuclear powered to be for 6 months in the Arctic waters? Should we join missile defense in the modernization of NORAD? Should we have a brigade in Europe as a permanently deployed troops to deter further aggression? We're not discussing these, I think, mostly political sensitive issues that would need much more money and also a change of defense posture. Should we focus on North America or the Middle East, as we just announced the renewal of Canada's mission of capacity building with the Iraqi army? Should we have not focused our attention to Eastern Europe, East Asia, or our own country? We don't debate these things. We just renew it on a Friday afternoon without nobody knowing? Should we focus on domestic operations? Should the Canadian forces be the tool that civilian authorities use to combat the pandemic, floods, incendie, and everything that's going on that increases the tempo of the Canadian forces? I doubt it, but we should create something alternative to this. So just to conclude, because I don't see how much time I have left, so I guess I'm coming close to my 12 minutes. Yeah. Just to conclude, I don't think there's an electroshock. So if I can link my presentation to what Stephanie just said, I don't think that, yes, you're there, yeah. I don't think that the invasion of Ukraine has created an electroshock in Ottawa. I don't see the sense of humiliation of not having anticipated it and not having deterred Russia from invading. I think that then the past trends are thus likely to shape the future of Canadian defense policy, which will remain a partisan instead of bipartisan, where we'll see again a lack of public debate instead of engagement with civil society. There will be no definition of our national interest and priorities, and we'll instead do programmatic reviews with hard choices that we should make. And our procurement system will continue to be dysfunctional because we're going to use it as an economic and political tool with a very risk-averse bureaucrats that are overseeing everything around this. And we will end up, as we are always, with the American security guarantee, this idea that we can do whatever we want with Canadian defense policy. It's costless. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. If it's fine, I will continue en français pour ma présentation. Je suis la dernière de la journée. C'est une chance, on est amis, donc je ne le prends pas personnel, mais je vais essayer de faire mon mieux pour quand même rester dynamique puis finir en beauté votre journée que j'ai manqué. Je m'en excuse. J'enseignais toute la matinée, mais je suis très heureuse d'être avec vous sur ce panel, mais je vais quand même faire des connexions avec un panel que j'ai malheureusement manqué cet après-midi sur les technologies émergentes et en fait le défi qu'il représente. Donc, ce que j'ai préparé pour ma présentation, c'est en fait quand d'ailleurs je l'ai remercié, Sarah Myriam Bruno m'ont invité à présenter, j'essayais de voir comment j'allais insérer mes intérêts de recherche et en vous proposant aujourd'hui une analyse, j'espère pertinente là, pour la réflexion. En fait, en réfléchissant sur le rôle du renseignement pour faire face aux défis dont les technologies émergentes, je me suis intéressée plutôt à un point de vue inverse, de quelle façon les technologies émergentes viennent poser un défi de taille au renseignement. Puis là, je me suis questionnée, je suis historiquement pas dans le renseignement, donc je me suis dit à quoi on fait référence? Est-ce qu'on a toujours une approche plutôt traditionnelle du renseignement? Mais en fait, je me suis mis à tourner donc un peu dans différentes directions et ce qui m'a amené à intituler ma présentation « Le Canada à la croisée de nouveaux écosystèmes de défense » en regardant mes thèmes d'intérêt, en fait, l'Union européenne et l'OTAN et voir en fait que ce qui se passe en ce moment, on voit quand même des changements assez importants. Si je commence déjà par l'Union européenne, oui, il y a la guerre en Ukraine et je pense qu'on est tous d'accord pour dire que c'est un accélérateur assez phénoménal d'une volonté d'aller de l'avant avec une défense européenne. On dit, bon, maintenant que la guerre est de retour en Europe, il faut développer, mettre les moyens à disposition. Mais ce qu'on peut dire, c'est que quand même, si on regarde juste dans les dernières années, il y a eu, oui, le Brexit, il y a eu la période de la présidence de Trump, qui avait déjà mis une pression. Et en fait, on a vu déjà beaucoup d'initiatives dans les dernières années au sein de l'Union européenne. J'en mentionne quelques-unes, mais pour dire en fait que des outils ont été mis en place pour déjà mettre à disposition de l'argent, ce qui est utile, donc du financement, avec entre autres, peut-être que vous avez entendu, le Fonds européen de défense qui permet donc de financer de la recherche, développer les capacités. Mais ce qui a manqué jusqu'à tout récemment, c'est une vision stratégique pour aller de l'avant et mettre en forme permettre de finalement donner un sens à ce nouveau financement. Et ce qu'on voit, c'est déjà l'année dernière un plan de synergie civilo-militaire pour les industries, donc civiles, spatiales et de défense. Et déjà, là, on a un changement de paradigme. Ce nouveau plan-là va changer la vision, que ce soit de l'espace, que ce soit de plusieurs domaines qu'on veut, au sein de l'Union européenne, voir dans une vision globale, commune. Et je commence en parlant de ça pour dire que depuis, si on regarde juste cette année, en début de cette année, il y a une feuille de route qui a été proposée par la Commission européenne sur les technologies critiques sur la sécurité et la défense et un plan d'action plus concret de la Commission européenne qui aboutit, et si vous avez vu récemment, on a parlé un peu le concept étrange de boussole stratégique. Qu'est-ce que ça mange en hiver? En fait, c'est une nouvelle stratégie de l'Union européenne avec une vision stratégique beaucoup plus affirmée sur ce que l'Union européenne peut faire dans le domaine de la sécurité et de la défense. Et cette stratégie-là, évidemment, un parcours assez intéressant, longtemps discuté dans un cadre où on n'avait pas de menaces concrètes. Et cette stratégie-là devait être soumise un peu plus tôt, mais ça a tardé. Avec l'intervention russe, on a remis à jour et il y a un ton beaucoup plus affirmatif et stratégie qui a été acceptée et adoptée par le Conseil, donc les représentants des États membres, le 21 mars dernier. Je vais survoler rapidement quelques points qui me semblent pertinents peut-être pour notre réflexion, puis comme je termine en termes peut-être d'ouverture sur peut-être ce qui nous amène à penser un peu la place du Canada dans ces nouveaux écosystèmes. Cette stratégie elle est intéressante parce que premièrement, elle met en pratique, elle opérationnalise des concepts d'un nouveau narratif européen sur l'autonomie stratégique, la souveraineté technologique, la souveraineté digitale, même la souveraineté européenne dont on ose parler, même au-delà de la France. Et donc, concrètement, à travers cette stratégie, cette boussole stratégique, on dit donc qu'il faut développer, puis je vais donner quelques exemples concrets qui se rapportent davantage à notre panel, développer, stimuler un renseignement commun conjoint. On sait que ça, c'est un tabou historique. On sait, bon, le renseignement en soi, c'est sensible. Le partager au sein de l'Union européenne, en faire une structure conjointe, commune, c'est déjà un pas, mais il y a une prise de conscience, évidemment, avec la guerre en Ukraine, qu'il faut une capacité unique d'analyse au sein de l'Union européenne que les États doivent davantage mettre en commun. Mais on va au-delà de tout ça. On veut relancer une politique pour faire des liens avec les panels que j'ai malheureusement manqués de cyberdéfense, mettre des outils pour une politique pour lutter contre la désinformation, surtout l'ingérence. Et donc, on veut mettre de l'avant donc des initiatives pour développer davantage les acquis de l'Union européenne, mais aller encore plus loin. Je veux souligner un point qui me semble intéressant si on parle de renseignement de données. Un des points importants de cette nouvelle stratégie, c'est de relancer une politique spatiale. En fait, on veut refonder le programme spatial européen, mais c'est un véritable tournant stratégique historiquement. L'Union européenne a toujours abordé l'espace dans une perspective civile, mais on sait les développements de la dernière décennie. Et là, c'est la première fois que l'Union européenne dit non, l'espace, c'est aussi un enjeu de défense. Il peut y avoir, plutôt de façon modeste, des débris qui tombent sur nous, mais dans le pire scénario, c'est un usage militaire du ciel avec des attaques. Et donc, l'espace devient aussi à considérer dans une perspective de défense. Puis là, je vois que le temps passe plus vite que je pensais, donc je vais juste dire quelques éléments. Mais dans le domaine spatial, qui prend beaucoup d'espace dans les discussions des derniers mois, on parle vraiment d'assurer la souveraineté européenne aussi dans l'espace et d'essayer de rattraper, comme dans plusieurs secteurs, la Chine, les États-Unis surtout. Et ça amène un discours assez intéressant où on va parler justement d'une souveraineté européenne, un accès autonome, sécurisé du domaine spatial. Puis là, je dois aller directement peut-être à un des exemples. On veut suivre les Américains et aussi la Chine dans cette idée de créer des méga-constellations de satellites en prenant le modèle aussi développé aux États-Unis où on collabore avec des entreprises privées pour développer finalement à grande échelle des constellations de satellites qui vont aussi pouvoir donc permettre d'avoir un accès sécurisé autonome aux données collectées, puis assurer aussi un accès dans la gestion sécurisée des données pour la défense. Et là, on a déjà aussi donc un aspect sur lequel je vais revenir qui vient transformer ce rapport entre les partenaires publics-privés dans des secteurs historiquement plutôt réservés au public. Donc, on s'inspire de ce qui se fait aux États-Unis pour justement même parler d'un cloud européen éventuellement où on pourrait, parce que c'est ça aussi le renseignement, c'est la collecte de données, la gestion, le stockage, mais les technologies émergentes viennent justement questionner la sécurité de ces données-là et ça ouvre évidemment sur toute la question de protéger les chaînes d'approvisionnement aussi dans le domaine spatial. Évidemment, l'Union européenne parle d'investir massivement dans plusieurs secteurs et justement pour garantir sa souveraineté technologique, de même mettre en place un observatoire des technologies critiques pour suivre, pour être sûr que, c'est l'exemple qui vient rapidement, des semi-conducteurs, que ce scénario-là ne se répète pas dans plusieurs domaines. Et un autre volet, je dois passer plus rapidement, je pense que j'ai été trop ambitieuse, c'est évidemment tous les partenariats, dont avec l'OTAN, sur lequel je vais m'arrêter un moment, et aussi au niveau bilatéral, dont avec le Canada. Où je veux en venir dans mon parallèle, c'est que je vais aller un peu trop en détail, mais au sein de l'Union européenne, donc beaucoup de choses qui bougent. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est de voir qu'à l'OTAN, depuis 2019, il y a un discours, il y a un plan d'action de plus en plus concret sur des mesures à prendre pour justement développer les bases industrielles des États membres et encourager l'investissement dans les technologies émergentes. Et donc, depuis 2019, il y a eu une feuille de route, une stratégie qui a été acceptée pour justement que l'OTAN se positionne plus concrètement dans ces secteurs, notamment pour développer, investir dans l'intelligence artificielle, les données informatiques, les systèmes autonomes, les technologies hypersoniques et l'espace, pour n'en donner que quelques-uns. Et point par point, l'OTAN a l'ambition justement de définir, approfondir chaque secteur. Et on a commencé par l'intelligence artificielle. Donc, à l'automne, en octobre, la première stratégie de l'OTAN sur l'intelligence artificielle a été adoptée. Et un point culminant de ce programme à l'OTAN pour soutenir, encourager le financement dans les technologies émergentes. Vous avez tous vu au sommet de Bruxelles, beaucoup de choses ont été dites en 2021, en juin, mais entre autres d'aller de l'avant pour encadrer cette volonté de l'OTAN de pousser les États à être à la fine pointe des technologies émergentes. Et donc, on a mis en place Diana, qui est en anglais plus conforme au Civil Military Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, so Diana, en français, accélérateur civilo-militaire, justement pour l'innovation en matière de défense. Et c'est l'idée de mettre en place un réseau de centres d'essais d'accélérateurs technologiques pour que les États investissent et soutiennent des startups. Donc, on revient avec des partenariats avec les entreprises, mais aussi avec le secteur universitaire, les experts, pour aller chercher l'expertise sur ces technologies et les développer. Et avant-hier, le Royaume-Uni et l'Estonie ont annoncé qu'ils allaient être en charge du premier quartier général européen pour cet accélérateur. Et il est prévu qu'il y ait aussi un quartier général nord-américain. Il restait encore à dévoiler son emplacement. Et ce qui a été annoncé en juin, c'est un fonds multinational de l'OTAN pour l'innovation et qui doit être mis en place progressivement. Et les deux instruments clés doivent être opérationnels pour Madrid, le prochain sommet de l'OTAN officiel, parce que là, il y en a plusieurs ces jours-ci, pour mettre en place ce fonds. Ce qui est intéressant, le fonds a été lancé par 17 États membres de l'OTAN, qui malheureusement n'inclut pas le Canada, mais qui ont mis en place donc 1 milliard d'euros pour commencer à lancer donc la recherche, le développement de ces technologies et soutenir le travail du Bureau de l'innovation de l'OTAN. Donc, ce qu'on voit au sein de l'Union européenne et de l'OTAN, c'est de part et d'autre plusieurs initiatives pour donc pousser les bases industrielles de recherche, de développement, identifier les secteurs de pointe pour éviter justement les dépendances, les vulnérabilités, et inclure de plus en plus les acteurs de la société civile, les universitaires et le secteur privé dans ces initiatives. Et là, mon interrogation, c'est où se trouve un peu le Canada dans tout ça? D'une part, le Canada, membre de l'OTAN, donc engagé dans les initiatives qui doivent donc être mises en place dans les mois qui viennent. Et avec l'Union européenne, évidemment, comme partenaire, il y a l'accord, le volet politique, de la CECG qui vise justement une coopération politique, notamment sur l'intelligence artificielle et dans d'autres secteurs de pointe, le Canada qui a un encart aussi pour coopérer dans la recherche, le développement. Et ce qui est intéressant, réaffirmé lors du sommet Canada-Union européenne aussi en juin 2021, qui avait été plutôt bénéfique tant sur le temps qu'au sein de l'Union européenne. Le Canada montre un intérêt certain pour contribuer davantage sur l'espace, les différentes initiatives. Et donc, on voit, je pense, une espèce de convergence où, si on pense dans un sens large au renseignement, collecte d'informations, de quelle façon les technologies émergentes, et c'est souvent ce qu'on dit, offrent beaucoup de possibilités, en même temps sont une source potentielle de menaces, de mauvaise utilisation. Donc, d'arriver déjà à les maîtriser. Le problème, c'est que c'est des technologies qu'on dit émergentes parce qu'elles sont toujours en développement, aussi encore une part d'inconnu sur leur réel potentiel et même leur réelle menace potentielle. Et donc, c'est de voir comment, et je vais terminer sur ça, l'émergence, plutôt, le développement de ces technologies émergentes a un rôle concret au sein de l'Union européenne et au sein de l'OTAN pour investir davantage, réduire les vulnérabilités, davantage ouvrir au secteur privé à différents acteurs, va transformer peut-être le renseignement dans une vision plus classique de la chose. Donc, c'est un peu sur cette note que je voulais vous laisser, en espérant peut-être créer une discussion sur le sujet. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, chers collègues, pour un très bon panel. Il nous reste 10 minutes officiellement à la journée, donc je sais on est peut-être un peu tous fatigués, mais si vous avez des questions en ligne, j'essaie de voir, ou dans la salle pour nos collègues. Évidemment, on a au moins, comme je disais, 10-12 minutes. Donc, je pense que j'ai quelque chose. OK. Bon, je n'ai rien ici. Will?
Thank you all for the present. My question is for Stan, and it's about this question we've seen a lot about whether or not NATO is enough to deter Ukraine. I'm wondering if you could kind of discuss around the question of NATO's obligation to deterring aggression against non-NATO members, right? The whole point of membership versus Ukraine's obviously non-membership. And related to that, is there a case of a comparable situation that we could view as deterring aggression against a non-NATO member, of course, that might help me understand that?
Thanks, Will. It's a good question. I don't sense that there's a similar case that we could draw from, but I had just 3 seconds to think of that prior to coming to the microphone. So maybe other examples will come in when we're drinking wine later. But what could have been done differently? It's very tough. It's history. So that's why I mentioned the counterfactual. It's easy for an academic to say, well, we should have done this, should have done that, because you weren't making the decision in 2008. We weren't arming properly the Ukrainian army, and we weren't signaling to Russia that there were red lines that needed to be crossed. Given the fact that the reaction of NATO is significant since the invasion, by doubling the number of troops in Eastern Europe and elsewhere in new countries, increasing the budgets and really sanctioning Russia like it never did against any other country, I assume that there was, and also given the significant support, military support we're giving to the Ukrainians to fight back against Russia, I assume that there's a general interest in having an independent and sovereign Ukraine from NATO perspective, which was not necessarily be the same case for Yemen. You know, NATO wouldn't defend Yemen or another country that be invaded, Ethiopia or another country in the world. That's not a member, because to answer your question, there's no legal obligation. That's for sure. Is there a political one? Yes, because something's happening. We aren't just ignoring the fact that there's weapon supply, there's support, as I mentioned. And so from that point of view, I think we need to answer and also given Ukraine's aspiration to become a member of NATO and its request of security guarantees to accept a peace agreement with Russia. Because if it becomes a neutral country and doesn't join NATO and it signs a deal, it wants guarantees that a future Russian aggression or violation of any ceasefire or peace treaty, if there was ever one, would be met by a response, not just by the Ukrainian army, but by NATO allies, perhaps on a bilateral rather than multilateral Article 5. But this is what President Zelensky asked, a Article 5-like security guarantee. And so I think there's a demand and there's a certain political will to provide it, which makes us think, should it have been done in 2008? Would it have deterred Russia from invading, or would it have provoked it, which was the sentiment of Germany and France in 2008? And you had only two countries supporting it, which was the United States and Canada. And of course, Canada didn't support Ukraine's membership into NATO because we were anticipating 2022, but basically because we wanted to score electoral points with certain communities in the country. And again, it comes down to the reasons why we make those foreign policy decisions that I try to emphasize in my presentation. Thanks.
OK. Quelqu'un? Ah, Stéphanie, vas-y, Stéphanie.
Merci, c'est autre pour Justin. Le récit du succès, est-ce que les médias ou les gouvernements, parce que je crois que les gouvernements sont plus prudents dans leurs évaluations de la guerre que les médias. Tu me comprends? I'll speak in English. Yeah, I was trying so hard. I try. Just say. This narrative of success, is it I think governments are more pessimistic than the media, and I would distinguish between the two in the sense that you were saying, like, you know, you started off your talk talking about successfulness, but I agree, and I think you do see on social media, in you know, even the tweets of senior EU officials and things like this. I think partially as a propaganda measure, not propaganda as a pejorative, but as a literal propaganda method. But I think if you hear the comments of intelligence officials, the ones behind the the ones that the anonymous sources in the rooms, if you listen to what the media, the actual, and if you can see what governments are doing, like scrambling to try to get this equipment to Ukraine, I think it's because their assessment is probably more pessimistic. So should we differentiate between the success narrative that we're hearing from the media and perhaps what's actually the conversations behind the scenes?
Well, thanks for reassuring me, because of course I haven't had those discussions with intelligence officials in Canada, and if they do have a different point of view than what I'm seeing in the media or the open sources information I gather, then that's great. But why is it then that the policy decisions are not coherent with that pessimism? Why have we not provided more and changed Canada's defense posture according to that pessimism? I still feel that there's a complacency, that everything will be fine because the Ukrainians will win and we don't have to do so much, and then the war will be contained because of Putin's incapacity to achieve its objectives in Ukraine. So he doesn't have the capacity to then go to different countries, and that Finland will join NATO, Sweden will join NATO, and everyone will be happy. I still feel that these are these. It seems to me that these are the ideas that are sustaining the defense, Canada's defense posture, and other countries as well, because we've seen a movement, we've seen a shift, but not something equivalent to what you mentioned as an electroshock. But hopefully there is one. It's just we are not seeing one, and I'm fine with that if you're correct.
Anything else to add, Stephanie? That's good.
It's late.
Yes, it is. Merci. Merci tout le monde. Avant de, en fait, vous laisser partir, ma collègue Sarah Myriam va clôturer la journée.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde pour cette belle journée. Puis c'est une journée si riche en discussion puis en réflexion. Of course, to conclude, I would like to thank those who made this event possible. And Chloe is not there right now. She just stepped out, so maybe I'll thank someone else until she comes in. But of course, she was there from the beginning, so I wanted to thank her. But one who's there is obviously John Rubayan, and maybe John, you could just come to the camera so we could actually see you. For his, no, please come. So for his extraordinary support throughout the journey of organizing this event, John Rubayan, and he's always there, always and behind the scenes. So this is shadow of success makes this event possible. So this magician behind the scenes. So John, we're always there. I also wanted to thank Françoise Conéa et Louis Collerette de la chaire Raoul d'Endurant qui ont été aussi d'un grand soutien dans l'organisation de l'événement. I won't keep you hostages for now. Of course, Adam Hughes and Avi Mora today from AVS Strategy that made this hybrid format being so smooth. Benoit Brault, Jill Morrison, and Sean Whittingull from ITS at Bishops that made that as well. But don't sit down. Come here. All right. And Chloe Berlin, of course, who was there from the beginning. So Chloe, who of course was also the co-brain in initially thinking about this conference, and who also made the beautiful designs of the posters and the banners. So she made the substance and also the great looks of this conference. So thank you very much, Chloe, for all of your support. Thank you so much. Thank you. Of course, Chantal Veilleux, Sonia Patnaud, Andrea Roberts, Isabelle Goyette from Bishops University, and obviously my partner in crime, Bruno Charbonneau, for his incredible support and patience and happiness throughout this journey that of course we had to surf together the pandemic waves. So we're still surfing on a pandemic waves, but of course, as you know, we had to postpone the event and in order to make it happen now in April. So thank you very much, Bruno, for this great partnership. So thank you. And thanks to all of you who came in person, and of course to the online participants. It's been recorded. It will be uploaded on the RAS website as well. So thank you. Have a nice evening. But before I will let you go, I will say that for the in-person, obviously we'll have a cocktail for the in-person participants here, and the art gallery is also open for you. It's a special exhibition really close to my heart because it's exhibiting the arts of our graduating students right now. So the art gallery is open just for you on a Friday night. So if you want to go and look around to see how Bishops has so much to offer in terms of the students, and to really look at the multidisciplinary of the talents that we have amongst our students. So thank you again, and have a wonderful evening, and see you to the next event, which is tomorrow. Thank you.